Everyone has a theory.
I know.
Who broke it up?
John.
John did.
Yeah.
And he tried to pin it all on you.
No, I don't think anyone tried to pin it on it. It just came out that way. There was a meeting where John came in and said, "Hey guys, I'm leaving the group."
Yeah. The inevitable question.
Are they ever going to get back together?
Yeah,
Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night outside his apartment building. News of the Lennon shooting, of course, spread quickly around the world.
Imagine a world filled with music that speaks of peace, love, and a yearning for freedom. That's the world John Lennon's music evokes. But beneath the surface of the legendary musician, there was a complex and often troubled soul. Who was John Lennon, the man behind the music? What childhood traumas shaped his life and fueled his passion for change? Why did he clash with his fellow Beatle, Paul McCartney? And how did he find love and inspiration with Yoko Ono? From his humble beginnings in Liverpool to the heights of global fame, we'll explore the triumphs and tragedies, the love and loss that shaped John Lennon's remarkable journey. In the midst of World War II, on October 9, 1940, a baby boy named John Winston Ono Lennon was born in Liverpool, England. His family wasn't rich. They were just regular folks trying to make ends meet during a tough time. John's dad, Alfred, worked on ships and was away from home a lot. He would send money back to John and his mom, Julia, but one day, the money stopped coming. Alfred had disappeared. 6 months later, he came back and wanted to take care of his family. But by then, Julia was pregnant with another man's child, so she said no. John's parents were busy with their own lives and didn't have much time for him. John's aunt, Mimi Smith, worried about him. She even called the social services twice because she thought he wasn't getting the care he needed. Eventually, John went to live with his Aunt Mimi. She took good care of him, but John still missed his mom and dad a lot. Even at a young age, John was a handful. He was kicked out of kindergarten after just 5 months because he was always getting into trouble and acting out. It was clear that little John had a big personality and a lot of energy, but he also needed guidance and love. In the summer of 1946, John's dad, Alfred, came back into his life for a short time. He took John on a trip to Blackpool, a seaside town in England, but he had a secret plan: to take John to New Zealand and start a new life without Julia. But Julia found out and followed them to Blackpool with her new boyfriend, Bobby Dykins. A big argument broke out, and Alfred actually made little 5-year-old John choose between his mom and dad. It was a really tough situation for a young child. Some stories say that John chose his dad at first, but then he started crying and followed his mom when she left. But other people who were there say the story was exaggerated. Whatever really happened, that was the last time John saw his dad for 20 years. John spent most of his childhood living with his Aunt Mimi and her husband George. They lived in a place called Woolton, and even though they didn't have any kids of their own, they took good care of John. His aunt bought him lots of books, and his uncle would do crossword puzzles with him. One time, his uncle even bought him a harmonica, which was John's first musical instrument. Even though John lived with his aunt, he still saw his mom a lot. She would visit him and play Elvis Presley records for him. She even taught him how to play the banjo and showed him a cool song by Fats Domino called "Ain't That a Shame." Music was starting to become a big part of John's life, and he was learning from the best, his mom. Growing up, John went to church and attended Dovedale Primary School. He was smart and did well on a special test, so he went to a stricter high school called Quarrymen. But John didn't really like the rules and restrictions at school. He was a free spirit and loved to have fun. People who knew John in school remember him as a happy and funny guy. He was always joking around and making people laugh. Instead of paying attention in class, he would draw funny pictures of his teachers and classmates for the school magazine. He also liked to write silly stories and poems. In his free time, John would often visit his cousin Stanley in Fleetwood. They would go to the movies together, and during school holidays, they'd even go to Blackpool to watch shows at the Tower Circus. John especially loved a performer named George Formby. In 1956, John's mom, Julia, helped him buy his first guitar. It was a simple acoustic guitar, not too expensive, and she even loaned him the money for it. But there was one catch. The guitar had to be delivered to her house, not to Mimi's. Julia knew her sister didn't think much of John's musical dreams. Mimi wasn't really thrilled about the guitar either. She didn't believe John would ever be famous and hoped he'd get bored with music soon. She would often tell him, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." In 1955, John's uncle George passed away, which was a sad time for him. But an even bigger tragedy struck in 1958 when his mom, Julia, was hit by a car and killed. It was a terrible shock for John, and he became very angry and upset. For the next 2 years, John drank a lot and got into fights. He was full of rage and couldn't seem to control his emotions. The pain of losing his mom stayed with him for a long time, and it inspired him to write one of the Beatles' most famous songs, Julia. John's behavior in high school got worse after his mom died. His teachers thought he was wasting his time and not trying hard enough. They said he had too many wrong ambitions and wasn't using his abilities. John's rebellious behavior caused a rift between him and his Aunt Mimi. He didn't do well in school and didn't want to work. Mimi had to talk to the principal of the Liverpool College of Art to get him in. In college, John started dressing like a teddy boy, a kind of rebellious style at the time. But even there, his behavior was a problem, and he was almost kicked out. John later admitted that he was just pretending to be tough. He idolized guys like Marlon Brando and Elvis Presley, but he wasn't really a tough guy. He was just a regular kid trying to act cool. He said he had to work hard to stop pretending and just be himself, but sometimes he still fell back into that street kid attitude when he felt insecure. John would even get in trouble just because of the way he looked. People assumed he was a troublemaker, even though he wasn't always. He felt like he had to put on a tough face to protect himself. He was unsure about his future, but one thing captured his interest and gave him direction: music. The guitar his mom had bought him sparked a passion that would change his life forever. At 15, John's passion for music led him to form a band called the Quarrymen. They named it after their high school, Quarry Bank, and started playing a mix of skiffle and rock and roll. Skiffle was a type of folk music that was popular at the time, often played with homemade instruments. The Quarrymen were full of energy and loved performing. In the summer of 1957, they played at a big party at St. Peter's Church. They played their instruments on the back of a truck during a parade and later on stage. It was only their second show, but it would change everything. It was at this performance that John met Paul McCartney for the first time. Paul was impressed by John's guitar playing and singing, and soon after, John invited him to join the band. This was the beginning of a beautiful musical partnership. Together, they would write some of the most iconic songs in history, signing their work as Lennon-McCartney. Years later, the songwriting team of Lennon and McCartney would be hailed as one of the greatest in history. But back then, it was just two young guys jamming out. Paul was drawn to John's rebellious spirit and couldn't help but be impressed by his older, carefree attitude. They connected over their shared love for music, and Paul even showed off his skills by playing some rock and roll hits before the Quarrymen's evening show. The guys were so impressed by Paul's guitar playing and singing that they invited him to join the band right then and there. It was a casual invitation, but it marked the beginning of a legendary musical partnership. Another member of the Quarrymen, Len Gary, later recalled that it felt like Paul was auditioning for them that night. He played a few chords on his guitar, and even though they didn't know he was left-handed, they could tell he was a natural talent. 2 weeks later, Pete Shotton, another band member, bumped into Paul while riding his bike in Woolton. He officially invited Paul to join the Quarrymen, and the rest, as they say, is history. Soon enough, Paul made his debut with the Quarrymen at a party held at the Conservative Club. By that time, the band's sound was shifting away from skiffle and leaning more towards rock and roll, prompting some of the original members, like Pete Shotton and Rod Davis, to leave. Aunt Mimi wasn't exactly thrilled with John's new friends. She thought they were from a lower social class and looked down on them whenever they came to visit. Paul's dad also wasn't too keen on John, thinking he was a bad influence. But despite their reservations, he allowed the band to practice in their living room. It was during these jam sessions that John wrote his first song, Hello Little Girl, which would later become a hit for another band in 1963. For John, the Quarrymen were more than just a band. They were a lifeline. They gave him a sense of belonging and a place to express himself. They were his buddies, his collaborators, and his escape from the challenges of everyday life. The Quarrymen were evolving, and soon, 2 more members joined the crew. Paul recommended his friend George Harrison, a talented guitarist, and John's art school buddy, Stuart Sutcliffe, joined as the bassist. Interestingly, it was Stuart who had a significant impact on John's personal growth and transformation. John started getting into books, especially the beatnik writers who were becoming popular in Britain. He even started paying more attention to his studies, and the Italian artist Amedeo Modigliani became his new idol, alongside Elvis Presley. But it was his friend Stuart Sutcliffe who really sparked a change in John. Stuart was a super talented artist, and John admired him a lot. He thought Stuart could be as famous as Picasso someday. Stuart was part of the cool bohemian art scene in Liverpool, and John wanted to be a part of that world too. But he still felt like a regular kid from the working-class suburbs. Even so, he and Stuart became good friends, even though John sometimes got Stuart into trouble, like getting drunk and starting fights in pubs. Despite this, John saw something special in Stuart. He convinced him to use the money he made from selling a painting to buy a bass guitar and join the band. This was a turning point for the group, and in early 1960 they officially became the Beatles. And you know what? It was Stuart's idea for the name. The band started getting more serious about their music, and it was time to choose a cool name. They were originally thinking of the Silver Beatles, but John had a different idea. He suggested the Beatles with an A, so it also sounded like the word beat. In 1960, they got a big break, an invitation to play in Hamburg, Germany, for 48 days straight. They needed a drummer for the trip, so they found a guy named Pete Best, who fit right in with their sound. John's Aunt Mimi was worried sick when she heard about the Hamburg gig. She begged him to stay in school and focus on his art, but John wasn't listening. Hamburg had a reputation for being a wild and dangerous city, full of vice and crime. It was a world away from Liverpool, but that didn't scare John. He was a free spirit and loved the idea of adventure. "Nobody controls me," he once said. "I'm uncontrollable. The only one who controls me is me, and that's just barely possible." So, off to Hamburg they went, and they ended up staying for over 2 years, playing in different clubs like the Indra Club, the Kaiser Keller, the Top 10 Club, and the Star Club. The Quarrymen's 48-day stay in Hamburg turned into a marathon of gigs, one residency blending into the next. They played night after night in smoky clubs, sleeping in cramped dressing rooms, and even sneaking across the street to the cinema to use the bathroom. This non-stop schedule honed their skills and tightened their sound, until John, Paul, and George could practically read each other's minds on stage. Hamburg wasn't all about music, though. It was a wild and exciting city, and John, like many others, experimented with drugs like Preludin to keep up with the late-night performances. Back in Liverpool, John's personal life was also evolving. He married his college sweetheart, Cynthia Powell, when he was 21. Cynthia had been there from the beginning, attending the band's early shows, and even traveling to Hamburg with Paul's girlfriend to visit the guys. But she wasn't always comfortable with John's wild ways and rebellious looks. When she found out he had a crush on the famous French actress Brigitte Bardot, she even dyed her hair blonde to try and impress him. He once asked Cynthia out, but when she told him she was engaged, he jokingly yelled, "I didn't ask you to fucking marry me, did I?" John could be jealous and possessive, and his anger sometimes scared Cynthia. One time, when they were dating, a guy even hit Cynthia because he saw her dancing with Stuart. This made her break up with John for a while, but he eventually apologized, and they got back together. He was still sometimes mean to her, but he never hit her again. Years later, John admitted that he used to be cruel to women, both verbally and physically. He said he couldn't express himself properly, so he resorted to violence. This realization led him to become a strong advocate for peace. In July 1962, Cynthia got pregnant, and John insisted they get married. Their wedding was a quiet affair, with their manager, Brian Epstein, as the best man. But it was a secret wedding, because Brian was worried that fans wouldn't like it if a Beatle was married. The Beatles were becoming incredibly popular in the UK at this time, and John's son, Julian, was born in April 1963 while the band was on tour. John didn't even get to see his baby until 3 days later. At first, John wasn't too keen on dressing up in fancy clothes and acting all professional on stage, but when he realized it meant more money for the band, he changed his tune, famously saying, "I'll wear a bloody balloon if somebody's going to pay me." So, with a new manager and a fresh look, the Beatles were ready to take on the world. But there was one more change to the lineup. Stuart Sutcliffe decided to stay in Hamburg with the love of his life, and Paul McCartney took over as the bassist. And with Pete Best out and Ringo Starr in as the new drummer, the final Beatles lineup was set. This group of 4 lads from Liverpool would go on to achieve incredible fame and success over the next 8 years. But did you know that John Lennon used to use different names, especially in the early days? He went by names like Dr. Winston O'Boogie, Booker Table, and even Captain Kundalini. Meanwhile, back in Hamburg, John kept writing letters to Stuart, who was struggling with his health. He was having headaches, trouble sleeping, and feeling sick. Sadly, in April 1962, Stuart died suddenly from a brain hemorrhage. It was a devastating blow to John, who found out the news when the Beatles arrived in Hamburg a few days later. After playing a show one night in Hamburg, John finally let his emotions out. He got really drunk at the after-party and started being rude to everyone. He was heartbroken over losing Stuart, his best friend and creative partner. It brought back painful memories of losing his mom, and he didn't have anyone else to share his wild ideas with. But even with this sadness, the Beatles kept moving forward. Their first single, "Love Me Do," came out in October 1962 and did pretty well in the UK. Then, in February 1963, they recorded their first album, "Please Please Me," in just 10 hours. John had a cold at the time, which you can hear in his voice on the last song they recorded that day, "Twist and Shout." John and Paul wrote most of the songs on the album together, but John hadn't quite developed his unique style of writing lyrics yet. He said they were just writing pop songs and didn't think too much about the words. The album was a huge success, staying at the top of the charts for a long time. It was a new record for a pop album back then. The single "Please Please Me" also reached #1 on the charts, and the band became even more popular. Paul McCartney later said that the other Beatles looked up to John like he was their own Elvis Presley. The Beatles went on tour, playing shows all over the place. John was always quick with a joke, and he even made a funny comment during a show for the Queen Mother and other important people. He told the audience, "For our next song, I'd like to ask for your help. For the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands, and the rest of you, if you'll just rattle your jewelry." He wasn't afraid to be a bit cheeky, even in front of royalty. The Beatles' fame exploded in the UK, and in February 1964, they made their historic debut on The Ed Sullivan Show in the United States. It was a massive event, watched by millions, and marked the beginning of their global takeover. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of touring, writing new songs, and even making a movie. During this time, John found time to write 2 books, In His Own Right and A Spanish in the Works. The first one was a collection of funny poems and stories with John's own drawings. It was filled with silly jokes and nonsensical words, kind of like the stuff you'd find in Alice in Wonderland. The book was a huge hit, selling a ton of copies in the UK alone. People loved the wordplay and compared it to the works of famous author James Joyce. The second book, A Spanish in the Works, came out in 1965 and was similar to the first one, full of silly stories and drawings. It wasn't as popular as the first book, but it still sold well. These books, released during the peak of Beatlemania, showed everyone that John was the clever one in the band and helped make pop musicians more respected. In the summer of 1964, the Beatles starred in a movie called A Hard Day's Night. It was a fun and funny film that showed a day in the life of the band as they prepared for a big TV show. Fans loved it, and it was a big success at the box office. Critics even said that the movie influenced other comedies and spy movies made in the late 60s. But filming wasn't always easy. There were funny moments, like when John and Paul switched roles during a scene where John was supposed to be mad at Paul. They couldn't stop laughing, and it took them 12 takes to get it right. But the filming also brought a serious moment for John. He had his first encounter with his father in 17 years. It was a brief and awkward meeting at the band's manager's office, ending with a frustrated John telling his dad to leave. A year later, in 1965, the Beatles released another movie called Help. This time, it was an adventure comedy about the band trying to protect Ringo from a crazy cult and some mad scientists who wanted his ring. The film was a hit, even premiering in front of royalty like Princess Margaret. Some people say that Help even influenced the way music videos are made today. The band also released the soundtrack for the movie as their 5th album. This was also the year the Beatles were honored by the Queen of England, becoming members of the Order of the British Empire. Talk about a royal seal of approval. But as the Beatles' fame grew, so did the chaos. John started to worry that their fans couldn't even hear the music at concerts because they were screaming so loud. The band had to play louder, but that meant their sound wasn't as good. The song Help actually reflected how John was feeling at the time. He was overwhelmed and stressed, and he even gained weight, calling it his Fat Elvis period. He was looking for a change, and that change would come in an unexpected way. One night, at a dinner party, John and George were unknowingly given LSD, a powerful hallucinogenic drug that was legal at the time. After their LSD experience, the boys were told to stay put, but they couldn't resist venturing out. In a nightclub elevator, they panicked, thinking it was on fire. It was a wild experience that showed the unpredictable effects of the drug. Despite the Beatles' massive success, John Lennon always stood out from the rest of the band. He was known for his outspoken opinions and rebellious nature, which sometimes got him into trouble. In 1966, John made a controversial remark in an interview, saying that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. This caused a huge uproar, especially in the United States, where people burned Beatles records and even threatened John's life. This controversy contributed to the band's decision to stop touring in America. After their last concert in 1966, John took on a new challenge, acting in a movie called How I Won the War. It was a funny but dark movie about war, and it was John's first and only non-musical role. He even got a haircut for the part, ditching his signature mop-top style. He also started wearing round glasses during filming, which helped him see better since he was very nearsighted. These glasses, which were considered old-fashioned at the time, would later become iconic and known as John Lennon glasses. A picture of John as Gripweed from the movie appeared in lots of magazines, even on the front page of the very first issue of Rolling Stone magazine. While filming in Spain, John got bored, so his bandmate Ringo Starr came to hang out with him. The whole experience was a refreshing change for John, who was starting to feel isolated from his usual role as a Beatle. On the set of How I Won the War, he was just another actor, hanging out with the crew and other cast members. He even insisted on being there every day, even when he wasn't needed, just to learn more about filmmaking. While in Spain, John and Cynthia rented a villa with their co-star Michael Crawford and his wife. The villa's iron gates and lush gardens reminded John of a place called Strawberry Field, a Salvation Army garden near where he grew up. This memory inspired him to write the song Strawberry Fields Forever, one of the Beatles' most famous and experimental tunes. In November 1966, John rejoined the Beatles to record new music. He started using LSD a lot, and some people think it changed him. It made him see things in new ways, but it also blurred his sense of self. John himself said that LSD was like self-discovery, but you had to be looking for it to find it. The Beatles released Strawberry Fields Forever as a single, and it was a big hit. It was praised for its unique sound and imaginative lyrics. Then, they released the iconic album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was a huge success, topping the charts in both the UK and the US. John Lennon's songwriting style started to change a lot during this time. Instead of simple love songs, his lyrics became more complex and thought-provoking. Some people wonder if his use of drugs like LSD influenced this creative shift. The summer of 1967 was a special time for the Beatles and the world. People were tired of war and violence, and a movement called the Summer of Love was born. About 100,000 young people gathered in San Francisco, sharing their love for music, peace, and freedom. John Lennon captured the spirit of this movement with his song, All You Need Is Love. The Beatles performed it for a worldwide TV broadcast, and it became a huge hit. It was a simple message of peace and love that resonated with people everywhere. After that, the Beatles started using LSD less, and even publicly spoke out against it. Instead, they embraced a new spiritual practice called transcendental meditation, taught by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They even attended a training session in Wales to learn more about it. But John still struggled with his inner demons, and he continued to use hallucinogens occasionally to try and find some peace and clarity. It was during one of these meditation sessions that the band learned about the death of their manager, Brian Epstein. It was another huge loss for them, but John, who had already experienced so much pain in his life, seemed to take it the hardest. He knew that without Brian, things would never be the same for the Beatles. Despite the Beatles' growing success, John started to become a bit distant from people, even Cynthia. He seemed to only really connect with his bandmates, who had this unspoken understanding of each other. Cynthia once asked him if they could go on a family vacation, but John was too focused on his music. He told her he had to keep working and writing songs. Cynthia understood his passion, but felt frustrated that she had never pursued her own career. John loved Cynthia and their son Julian, but he was becoming more and more consumed by his work on the Beatles' new album. In February 1968, the Beatles went to India to study with a spiritual leader named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. John was particularly interested in this experience, hoping to find some inner peace. While there, they wrote most of the songs for their next album, the famous White Album. But things were about to change for John. Before the trip to India, Cynthia stumbled upon letters between John and Yoko Ono, an artist he had met in London. John had been intrigued by Yoko's art, even though he wasn't a fan of conceptual art at first. He tried to downplay it, saying she was just a quirky artist looking for support. But secretly, they were exchanging letters and phone calls like crazy. In India, John even insisted on having a separate bedroom, claiming he needed to meditate alone. But the truth was, he was eagerly checking the mail every morning for letters from Yoko. When they got back from India, John confessed to Cynthia on the plane that he had been with thousands of women all over the world. It was a devastating blow to Cynthia, who had tried her best to support him. Things came to a head when Cynthia returned early from a vacation in Greece to find John and Yoko sitting together in their house, wearing bathrobes. This was the final straw, and they got divorced later that year. During this tumultuous time, the Beatles were busy starting a new company called Apple Corps. It was supposed to be a creative outlet for them, a way to have more artistic freedom. But even this new venture was filled with drama. Their first single on the Apple label was John's song, Revolution, which had a message of peace. But some people in the media made fun of it, saying it wasn't strong enough. Despite the criticism, the Beatles continued to push boundaries. In November 1968, they released the White Album, a double album that was a huge mix of different styles of music, from folk and blues to experimental and avant-garde. It was a critical and commercial success, hailed as one of the greatest albums of all time. By the end of 1968, the Beatles' newfound business venture, Apple Corps, was struggling. John's heavy drug use and growing obsession with Yoko Ono, coupled with the band's disagreements about how to run the company, made it clear they needed professional help. John even asked Lord Beeching, a well-known businessman, to take charge, but he turned them down, telling John to stick to music. Eventually, they hired Alan Klein, a tough manager who had worked with the Rolling Stones. John, George, and Ringo agreed to let him run Apple, but Paul never signed the contract. There was trouble brewing within the band. John and Yoko's relationship was heating up, and they got married on March 20th, 1969. They even released a series of artistic prints called Bag One that showed scenes from their honeymoon. But some of the pictures were considered too risque and were banned in many places. In September 1969, John Lennon officially quit the Beatles. He had agreed to keep it quiet for a while, but Paul McCartney spilled the beans when he released his first solo album in April 1970. John was furious, feeling like Paul was stealing the spotlight. He later said, "I started the band, I disbanded it." It's as simple as that. John's solo career started strong with his debut album, John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band, 1970. Critics loved it, but it wasn't a huge commercial success. The album was super personal, with raw lyrics about his childhood and his struggles. One song, Mother, was a heart-wrenching look at his feelings of being abandoned as a child. Another song, Working Class Hero, was a harsh critique of society and even had some curse words that radio stations didn't like. In 1971, John got involved in political activism. He wrote a song called Power to the People after a conversation with a revolutionary named Tariq Ali. This song was more aggressive than his earlier anti-war song, Revolution. But John later admitted he didn't really like Power to the People and wrote it because he felt guilty and wanted approval from radicals like Ali. John also got involved in a protest to support Oz magazine, which was being accused of being obscene. He called the whole thing disgusting fascism and released a song with Yoko Ono in support of the magazine. In 1970 and 1971, John and Yoko went through a type of therapy called primal therapy. It was supposed to help them deal with emotional pain from their childhoods, but it was pretty intense, and they had to go back to England when their visas expired. In 1971, John Lennon wanted his next album, Imagine, to be a big hit. He made the music more welcoming for everyone. People said the title track became really popular for saying no to wars, but another song called How Do You Sleep was about Lennon and Yoko Ono fighting with Paul McCartney. In Jealous Guy, Lennon apologized for treating women poorly and said it was because he felt insecure for a long time. Lennon made another album in 1972 called Sometime in New York City and worked with a band called Elephant's Memory. The songs talked about women's rights, race, and Lennon's problems with the government. Most people didn't like it, and Lennon wasn't happy either. The two of them held concerts to help people in an institution for mentally disabled people. After that, Lennon played his last big shows. After George McGovern lost the 1972 presidential election to Richard Nixon, Lennon and Ono attended a post-election wake held in the New York home of activist Jerry Rubin. Lennon was depressed and got intoxicated. He left Ono embarrassed after he had sex with a female guest. As John was gearing up to record his new album, Mind Games, in 1973, he and Yoko decided to take a break from each other. John would later call this 18-month period his lost weekend, a reference to a movie about a guy who goes on a crazy bender. During this time, John lived it up in Los Angeles and New York City with his new girlfriend, May Pang. Mind Games was released in November 1973, but it wasn't as successful as some of his earlier work. Interestingly, John also contributed a song called I'm the Greatest to Ringo Starr's album, marking a rare occasion where three former Beatles, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, recorded together after the band's breakup. But things started getting messy in early 1974. John was drinking heavily and getting into trouble with his friend Harry Nilsson. One night at a club called the Troubadour, John put a sanitary pad on his forehead and got into a fight with a waitress. A few weeks later, he and Nilsson were kicked out of the same club for heckling the Smothers Brothers. It was not a good look for John. Despite the chaos, John decided to produce Nilsson's album, Pussycats. They rented a beach house in Los Angeles for the recording sessions, but things quickly spiraled out of control. There were wild parties and lots of drinking, and the sessions were a disaster. John eventually went back to New York with May Pang to finish the album. During this time, John also produced a song for Mick Jagger called Too Many Cooks Spoil the Soup. But because of some legal issues, the song wasn't released for over 30 years. It finally appeared on a Mick Jagger Greatest Hits album in 2007. In early 1975, John and Elton John even performed together at Madison Square Garden. It was a big deal because John had promised to join Elton on stage if Whatever Gets You Through the Night reached #1, even though he didn't think it would. That same year, John released another album called Rock and Roll, which was full of covers of old songs. He even made a surprise appearance on a TV special, playing guitar and singing Imagine with a mask-wearing band called Etc. He did this as a joke because he thought the guy in charge of the special was two-faced. But then, things took a quieter turn. In October 1975, John and Yoko's son, Sean, was born. John decided to take a break from music and become a stay-at-home dad. He spent the next 5 years taking care of Sean, making him meals and playing with him. He even wrote a song called Cookin' in the Kitchen of Love for Ringo Starr's album. During his break, John did lots of drawing and even started writing a book about his life, but it wasn't published until after he died. After 5 years away from music, John was ready to come back. In 1980, he released a new single, Just Like Starting Over, and a new album with Yoko called Double Fantasy. They had written the songs while on a sailing trip in Bermuda, where John had a blast steering the boat through a storm. The album was all about how happy he was with his new family life. On December 8, 1980, a sunny afternoon in New York City turned tragic. John Lennon, the legendary musician and peace activist, was leaving his apartment building, the Dakota, with Yoko Ono. A fan named Mark David Chapman approached him and asked for an autograph. John, always kind to his fans, signed a copy of his album Double Fantasy for Chapman. But later that evening, as John and Yoko were returning home, Chapman was waiting for them. He shot John 4 times at close range, twice in the back and twice in the shoulder. It was a senseless act of violence that shocked the world. John was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival at 11:15 p.m. The news of his death spread quickly, leaving fans and loved ones devastated. Yoko Ono issued a statement the next day, saying there would be no funeral for John and asking everyone to pray for him and for peace. John's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in Central Park, where a special memorial called Strawberry Fields was later created in his honor. Mark David Chapman, the man who took John's life, pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. In the weeks after John's death, his music soared to the top of the charts. Just Like, Starting Over, and Double Fantasy became #1 hits in both the UK and the US. His iconic song, Imagine, also reached the top of the charts, a testament to his enduring legacy and the impact his music had on the world. Even another band, Roxy Music, paid tribute to John by covering his song, Jealous Guy, which also became a #1 hit. It was clear that even though John was gone, his music continued to live on, inspiring and touching the hearts of millions around the world.